Bonjour à vous. Bonjour Emma Becker.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Emma Becker.
Quand on rencontre des écrivains,
I wanted to ask you questions. Often when I meet writers, they say, I've always wanted to write. When I was a child, I knew I would write. But I doubt that any 10-year-old would think I'm going to write erotic novels. So how did this happen for you? Did you know you wanted to write and then you homed in on erotic literature, or did that come later? Well, I might be disappointing you, but I'm a person who has always written, not always the same caliber writing, and my wish to write started very young. I read a book by the American writer Nicholson Becker, who published a book called Point d'Orgue in French in 1996, which had a lot of erotic scenes in it. I wouldn't call it an erotic novel, but it had erotic scenes. And I remember reading it and having feelings I'd never had before. And from then on, I wanted to write the same kind of book and give people the same kinds of sensations and feelings. It was quite extraordinary, this desire that I felt. So that's how I started out. In what way is erotic literature special compared to traditional or conventional literature or other genres? Well, personally, I have found a sort of contemplation in it, which has become my language. I've always found it interesting to unbundle desire, the spark that makes you want to be in physical contact with someone. When we talk about desire and eroticism, the subject is much broader than we think. It's about the immense solitude that every human feels in his or her existence, and this desperate and touching desire to lessen that solitude by getting closer to another being. It was also a vice, well, or should I say, my own little guilty pleasure. I create an entire world, an entire universe, and for me, it's always been a very joyful exercise, and it's new every time I start a new book. Do you have any other influences you'd like to mention apart from Nicholson Becker, sorry. Yes, I started with him, and then I read all of the major erotic writers, most of them men. And I was very interested in Régine Desforges when I was 13, 14. The Blue Bicycle was one of my major erotic experiences of my teenage years. Then I discovered Françoise Frey, an erotic writer that people were talking a lot about in the 1980s, but not so much now. Her language was something I found very touching because it was very far removed from the language that women are usually allowed to use in erotic literature. Women are often limited to paraphrases and metaphors, and Françoise Frey had a very direct style. There wasn't all this fluff around her narrative, which is often the case in women's or erotic literature or erotic literature written by women. So I was marked by her and also by comic book authors. I often write. I often wonder what would this look like in pictures as I'm writing. So you have images. Yes, I have images that come to me. Smells as well. I grew up with a lot of comic books always around me, and I always wonder what would this look like if we had the dialogue bubble. Much more so than trying to put it in a film form. And these images are very valuable for me. So why don't you write a comic book then? I'm not a very good artist. Well, what about you could work with somebody else? Yes, I know. I have plans. I should really put these into implementation. It's always been my dream to write a graphic novel. Let me come back to the previous question. Nicholson Baker is a pseudonym, isn't it? Was that something that came from Nicholson Baker? No, it came from my grandmother. My grandmother's name was Becker, and I decided to shorten it and just call myself Becker. So Becker, Baker, it's an interesting coincidence. Yes, maybe I didn't realize that there was this connection. Odile l'été is your 5th novel, and in fact it was commissioned. It was a commission. In what way did that change the writing project? Well, it changes it a great deal, because before I wrote Odile, I had never signed a contract before I had a book to put on the table. This was the first time that I had pressure to find my story in a given time frame. And I found it very energizing. It forced me to get to work, sit down every day, and come up with an idea that was going to turn into a book. The collection created by Vanessa Springora is aimed at erotic literature removed from the male gaze, where the male gaze is not present. And this gave me the opportunity to talk about something that I never talk about. This was a huge part of my my experience as a young woman, experiences in relationships with women. When I was younger, very young, and during my adolescence. And when I thought about those past experiences, I thought that they were so fluid and so smooth. Why did I absolutely want to have relationships with men? Since I started having relationships with men, I have a very clear image of adversity and power struggles, and the relationships are very much less smooth than the relationships I've had with women. So this made me wonder whether this attraction I have for men is something that I learned, that was nurtured or formatted into me, or is it an irrepressible taste? And what is the role of the gaze of men for me? So the collection that Vanessa Springora started is called Troublemaker. What do you think? Do you think you're a troublemaker? I've asked other colleagues who write erotic literature. I don't think we're writing about eroticism to be subversive or overturn the apple cart. I think, however, that very often this is what we're associated with. Women talking about their sexuality and their sexual imaginings is considered as subversive. In fact, often the subversion is in the eyes of the spectator and not in what the author actually wrote. And I think it's very interesting, having said that, to have you coined this term troublemaker in the feminine, to talk about eroticism without necessarily talking about men, to see what happens when you take men out of the equation. What is female eroticism? But there was no intention to cause any disorder or upset the established order. I think that feminist erotic literature, the aim is to bring peace to the relationships between two sexes, but at the same time giving their women back their agency, their freedom, their access to their own desires, and allowing them to figure out where their desire comes from. In female fantasies, we often find a recurring theme around things which are a million miles from what feminism dictates. So how much of this actually belongs to us? What is a troublemaker, a female troublemaker? I thought it was interesting. Would you be able to sum up your book? Because there is a plot, a history, a story. Yes, there's a story in it. The narrator, who is not named, dreams about a friend who she shared a lot of experiences with when she was a young girl and a teenager, and who she hasn't seen for about 10 years. So she has a dream about her friend, Odile, and she decides to go visit her and to talk to her about their relationship and to find out what has happened in the 10-year interval. The two women have very different lifestyles. They live far away from one another, how their relationships with men have developed, and where they stand really 10 years on. For me, this was a good opportunity to talk about my childhood and my adolescence and get into contact with my feelings as a woman and to unpack this attraction for men that I have. That may seem like something normal and banal, but it isn't for me. Male-female relationships are so turbulent that I have to wonder what attracts women in men. It's not the simplest mode of relationship. Perhaps sexually it's satisfying. Perhaps the two sexes are interested sexually in the other, but I don't know if I can really sum it up any better than that. The title of this session is Power, Emancipation, and Eroticism. So that's a pretty big, a pretty tall order. What do you have to say about this? What do these three words have to do with your writing? Well, this is what I was saying. When I started to have relationships with men, I realized that we were not on an equal footing. When I began to have sexual relationships with men, it wasn't just after the 1960s where everybody was saying, let's all sleep with each other and it's all very peaceful and joyous and it's just pleasure for everyone. I'm not saying that it wasn't like that, but in my relationships with men, there was clearly a question of who has the power, who's winning. And there was a lot of adversarial posturing. So that's what power means to me. Emancipation is part of this process that I entered into of unpacking what attracts us to each other. For me, there's no mystery as to why men are attracted by women. All you have to do is look at women and you understand, and then you can write about it. It's, women are objects of worship. But conversely, and I'm not even talking about aesthetics. Men can be very beautiful, but from a relationship and sexual and sentimental point of view, there are so many stumbling blocks that one has to wonder whether this is a taste that young girls learn throughout their upbringing since we were tiny, since in the cartoons we watch in our mothers, our relationships with our mothers, etc. When I was a little girl, I was very interested in boys or older men who were my father's friends, and I would hover around them. Why? Where does this precocious interest in men come from? And isn't it a form of training that young girls are subjected to? More or less consciously, we're being prepared to become mothers, wives, and in a certain sense, submissive to men. So the concept of emancipation, which I use in my book, is not about contesting, canceling, or denying my taste for men, whether it's natural or learned. I think that whether we like men or women, we can only love them more by trying to understand them better. This is the whole masturbatory side of erotic literature. We don't need to understand why we love something or like it, but understanding brings a different level of love, a different dimension, contemplation, full of contemplation and tenderness. To come back to power, there are a lot of power plays in your book. the narrator trying to control Odile, and the opposite. Is the power sexual? Yes, this is it's a very personal point of view. I didn't want to be seen to be saying that relationships between women are simple and male-female relationships are uncomplicated. There's no set rule. A relationship between two women can be just as complex and perhaps as tumultuous or turbulent as a relationship with a man. But I can only write about what I know. So Odile did not exist as such. She's a composite of many women with whom I had relationships. But I started writing this book because as I was perusing my memories, I thought, oh, this little girl who I was attracted to, I wasn't madly in love with her. There were moments when I hated her, when we hated each other. And it was interesting for me that these games I played as a little girl were revolved around heterosexual seduction plays, what you see in cartoons, what you see in films. Neither of us had ever had a crush on a boy or a man, but we were reproducing patterns, binary patterns, cliches, absolutely. If she played the man, I would play the woman. So the man was the one who decided, who made the suggestions, and the woman just went along with it. This was a clear reproduction of all the Disney films we watched with the recumbent princess who allowed herself to be carried off. I found there was something erotic in that passivity, that passive posture, and also in the aggressive posture. So, of course, there are power games. And sometimes they are more mysterious than the games that these two women play with men. Because I think that what women perform every day with men there's no mystery in it. We all know the score. How are we all playing to the same score so uniformly? It's because we've all learned it since we were perhaps too small to even be able to verbalize it. Well, when we read your book, we get the idea that homosexuality is a national inclination, heterosexuality is something a bit strange, and in the final chapter, we get the idea that we might be able to do without men. Men are completely superfluous. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. The last sentence. The men get saved at the last minute. No, well, to live in today's world, and I don't think I'm the only one, I think that female bisexuality or homosexuality is very much encouraged by men. It's not something that we are told we should be ashamed of. Women are encouraged to do it because men find it exciting, and they're not threatened. This is my theory. They're not threatened because the main difference is that there's no male organ involved. Two women making love do not threaten men because there is no cock, basically. So I think that for the vast majority of men, there's no threat in women having relationships with others. But now, the real question is, what do we women become if we take men out of the equation? Can we just be ourselves? I think the book proves that this is not completely possible because what's at stake is not that simple. I've never been tempted to say that men are useless. I think that the adversity between men and women may have some sort of erotic spiciness in it. We can continue to interrogate that, but I think it would be interesting to wonder what female sexuality would be like if we didn't feel we needed to excite or please men. My desire for men and the desire that men might have for me doesn't give me a lot of perspective, but I do ask myself the questions. I can't say I'm immune to an attraction to men. That's why my book is in no way subversive. I'm not trying to upset things. I'm writing as a woman who grew up in the world that we live in and who's been a slave of the male gaze and is trying to free herself from that as well as she can. Well, then I'd like to ask you what the role of mothers is in all of this. It was interesting what you said a minute ago. You said that you used to watch Disney films with all their cliches and platitudes. What role do mothers play in the predisposition of young girls? Well, I think mothers play the role that their mother played. In the book, I'm not saying that my mother did this, but it was obviously based on my mother. Around the age of 5 or 6, I had a crush on one of my father's friends who was maybe 33 or 35. And I remember that he came to dinner one evening, and I had put on my best little shirt and a barrette in my hair. And when he came in, my mother said, "Look, oh, she knew you were coming. Look, she's put on her nicest clothes. Isn't that cute?" Of course it was cute, but when you read between the lines, what was happening there, really? Metaphorically, wasn't that a mother pushing her daughter towards a man, preparing her daughter to become a woman? And what is a woman supposed to do? A woman is supposed to be pretty, supposed to please men, supposed to humor men's moods. I don't want to blame women because we have all grown up in the same kind of cage. We're not always conscious of it. But when we do, we have to ask ourselves, how can I get out of this? I'm only describing a system in which we all came up, me included. I became what I became, what I have become. If I'd been more combative or more angry, maybe my book would have been different. But the fact is that I felt comfortable in this system for a long time. I understood the language. I knew what men wanted, and it was a role that I knew by heart. I can imagine that at one point this started to annoy me, and I decided to change it. I don't want to take a Bettelheim-like position on mothers, women, because they're just repeating what they learned, and they predispose us to doing the same. But so much has changed. How is it that this hasn't changed? Well, I have 2 sons, and when my 2 little boys were born, I realized, and I'm not very proud to have to say it, but I realized that it would have been difficult for me, but much more difficult for me to have girls, because I know what life holds in store for them. I know how they're usually educated, raised. My mission is to raise boys to men. My boys will be less toxic for women. My aim is to raise functional men who can have healthy relationships with women. And now I've forgotten your question. No, I think you've answered it, more or less. How can we explain the fact that things don't change? The generations come and go, and so many things have changed in so many areas. How is it that this has not changed? Because I think these things take a long time to change. Look at the progress we've made over 10 years in terms of women being able to speak and deconstruction. Men have changed a lot over the last 10 years. So I think it's a structural issue, and structural issues require generations of change. But I think what's crucial is to become aware of the world that we're living in, and where girls are still being brought up to be future, I wouldn't say geishas, that's a bit harsh, but you see what I mean. And boys are raised in a completely different way. When I talk to my friends who have little girls, they always say, yes, but girls and boys are not different. I think it's just a difference in the way we raise them. I don't think that fundamentally the personality of a girl or a boy has any specific traits that are gender-related or gender-linked. So this is going to take time, but becoming aware is a first step towards more peaceful male-female relationships.
I remember having a conversation with Elisabeth Badinter, who was the feminist. She had a boy and a girl, and she explained that as children, the boy would go towards the truck and the girl towards the doll. And it wasn't because she didn't try and mix things up a little bit. I don't know. I've got little boys who play with trucks, they play with dolls. They're quite happy doing both, and there's something reassuring when I see a boy playing with a truck and a girl playing with a doll. I'm not saying anything against anyone. Of course we need to be reassured. These patterns are very comfortable because they're age-old. They've been passed on from one generation to the next, and it's hard to leave this comfort. It's hard to do away with one's habit to enter unknown territory. How can we educate, bring up girls and boys the same way? It's a fight, a constant fight against our own education, against what we were told, what we were taught. But I am absolutely convinced. My mother is a psychologist in a daycare center, and very often she says it's not boys who don't want to play with dolls, it's parents who don't want their boys to be given a princess costume or a doll. I don't think you need to be a radical feminist to realize how silly it is to stick to such patterns. Boys can learn a lot from playing with dolls and girls playing with trucks. If we managed to change this simple vision of life very early on, it would make a huge difference. Several times in your novel, we get the notion that sex is the only way for you to be self-aware. What does this mean exactly? Well, I say so, but I'm able to say the exact contrary 5 pages later. I write this book after having written my novel La Maison. I spent 3 years working in a brothel. It may sound anecdotal, well, not really, but it does change the way you relate to sex and the way you see your relationships with both men and women. My problem has always been that I have a hard time being self-aware during sexual intercourse because I'm always withdrawn. I'm always wondering about the image I'm conveying to the other. Was I winning this encounter? Was he spending a nice time? That was my first concern. And it's still a huge effort for me to be present, to be self-aware during sexual intercourse. There's this sort of state of mind of the writer, regardless of what I'm doing. I'm always a little withdrawn because I'm trying to figure out whether from this experience I could do something with this experience. So I'm always looking at things from a distance. I was constantly representing myself, and I wasn't really enjoying what was happening to me. And literature helped me experience what I had just felt and have the sensations that I did not feel on the moment. So when I'm there, what can I say about it? When you write, you don't feel, or you feel with a delay. I think most writers, most authors can say the same thing. They look at themselves live, and they think about what they'll be able to do with that. Yes, absolutely. When, as a writer, you write on your own sexuality and the changes and swings in your sexuality, it changes things a little bit. There are very few moments in time when I have sex without writing. Not simultaneously, of course. But I always get the feeling that beyond physical pleasure or total indifference. There are lots of things that can happen that go way beyond sexuality. The other opens up to you. Your partner opens up to you, and there's no erotic tension in it. It's very moving. It's very authentic. You're entirely a human being. And all of this is mixed up in my mind. So the book that I wrote that will be published later in the year is a true love story. There are a few sex scenes, but they're written very differently because these are things that I really felt. And it's a miracle as a woman, as a writer, to feel something like pleasure, to be in relation with my body, to be there where I am present. That's a miracle. And this brings me back to my condition as a woman. Being a woman and being a writer, to me, is having the same perspective on your life. As a woman, you always want to appeal to others. You're pushed to smile. There's always a distance between you and yourself. And to me, that's really typical of writers, too. And in this novel that is to be published in September, it's different? Yes, absolutely. It's something that I wrote pretty spontaneously. I didn't take that step back. I didn't have the ability to take that step back to look at the spontaneous emotions and analyze them. Sometimes I find them kind of silly and childish. I'm not always very nice with myself. Which is the reason why I want to annihilate the joy in me. I say to myself, okay, you're quite happy right now, but in 6 months' time, you won't feel that joy anymore. So things are very different with a distance. Why did you choose autobiographical fiction? What you write is between autobiography and fiction, but there's a lot of you in what you write. Is it because of the inspiration? Is it out of honesty? Is it a conscious decision that you made? Did it come naturally to you? I think it came when I realized that there was this split in me. Writing about myself was a way of running after the truth about me. I love fiction. I read Stephen King, Lovecraft. I love that kind of literature, so I love fiction and other writers. But I get the feeling that the best works of fiction have already been written. Real life is filled with moments where you don't need to fill with fiction. Life is full of surprises. It's full of things that are unexpected. And I think I also write because I like the idea that I might resonate with my readership, even if I only have a single reader. I always think there's bound to be one or two crazy people who just think like me and who'll feel less alone, because for me, the true tragedy in life is the fact that you're constantly alone. And my interest in eroticism is because of that. When you're with someone, you're having sex, trying to have sex, it's a moment in time where you do not feel alone. And don't be mistaken, I like being alone. That's the way I work best, but it's terrible. I think it's a real tragedy. When you write, you create bridges between people, and it's absolutely fabulous. It's a great job. Do you expose yourself more when you write an erotic novel rather than a traditional novel? Yes, in a sense. People tend to laugh about it. They're ill at ease with novels about the body. Sex is also funny. And if you don't like it, you can always laugh about it. So, yes, I guess in a sense, you expose yourself more. But I get the feeling that I expose myself more when I speak about my dying grandfather in L'Inconduite. than when I talk about meeting up with guys in parks in Berlin. This notion, these sexual adventures, meeting guys in parks, that's something that I share with the whole wide world. It's nothing specific. Whereas mourning, the fact that you're losing someone you're close to, you may tell it the way you want, but when people read the fact that your grandfather is dying, people tend to shrug and say, well, it's natural. You're bound to lose your grandfather. But sexuality is merry, you feel alive, you feel happy. Whereas when you're faced with mourning, with suffering, it's a lot more complicated. It's a lot more indecent. Do you think there's a way of writing that's different between men and women in eroticism, erotic literature, and literature in general? Yes, absolutely. It would be hypocritical to say the contrary. Erotic literature fell within the purview of men exclusively. But what do men write about when they write erotic novels? When I wrote L'Inconduite, men came to me to tell me, I like what you write, you're not a combative feminist. Obviously, men read what they want to read in what I write. But I was also told if a man wrote half of what you wrote, it would be scandalous. Well, men wrote way more than I did, and they went way further than I did. The difference is when men talk about eroticism, they don't talk about frustration, they don't talk about loneliness. It's a series of conquests, of sex scenes. I would like to read erotic literature written by men where they could talk about their sexual flaws, erectile dysfunction, amongst others. So they could talk about the weaknesses of men's sexuality. They're very eager to talk about themselves as a walking cock, but women know it's not the case. And that's the only thing they talk about. They talk about their sexual power, whereas women, when they talk about eroticism, they talk less about the body. They talk more about the sensations, about the feelings. They try and analyze their own desire. This feeling that they feel shoot up in their bodies, and there's something much more indecent, shameless in women's literature. But just look at the way women talk about sex amongst themselves. It's a lot more obscene than between women. They give a lot more graphic details. Women's sexuality is meant to be very complex. I didn't understand anything about sex. That's why I started writing about it. In Sade's literature, you would read about women coming 7 times in a couple of seconds, but in reality it wasn't the case. So where did that difference come from? I think it may come from the fact that Sade is a man. Men have constant fantasies about women, and Sade wrote about these women who come several times in very little time. It can happen, but we need to be given the opportunity. When women talk about erotic literature, they try to explain to men how it works. They try to tell men that it's not that complicated, that all you need to do is apprehend the pleasure of your partner, and that's taught to, or men are not taught how to contemplate how pleasure starts, how it evolves. It's a very fun activity. Feminists gave you a hard time. What do they hold against you? Well, it depends on the feminist you're talking about. At the time my novel La Maison was published, it's the novel about my experience, my 3-year experience in a brothel. I had a hard time with radical feminists. That was in 2019. I'm talking about abolitionists who, according to me, may try protecting women, but they take away their agency over their own sex life. And these radical feminists, these abolitionists, fulfill the same role as masculinists. They say you don't have any agency on your sex life, on your imagination, because everything is in the hands of men. In their minds, there's no way out of it for women unless they constantly fight against themselves or against their education. From then on, you may wonder, when can we just sit down and appreciate things for what they are without constantly having to wonder whether this fantasy, did I develop it for myself, or is it just a reproduction of patriarchy in my mind? Personally, I consider myself a feminist. I was a feminist long before I started working in a brothel, but the experience in the brothel reinforced my feminism. And same thing with motherhood, becoming a mother and seeing how motherhood falls in the hand of the same people time and time again. That has also reinforced my feminism. I came to realize that in our lives we submit to a whole slew of other people. And I'd be interested in knowing what the feminists have to think about my novel L'Inconduite, in which I talk a lot more about motherhood. They say I'm not as combative as against men. I'm not going to fight. I like men. I like being loved by men. I don't feel like I have to defend myself against this. It's part of my life. I don't want to have to waste my youthful years wondering why, how, and that's it. And unfortunately, they can't all be put down. We've got to make do. We've got to find a way. It wouldn't be doing men and women a service if we were constantly challenging our attraction to each other. Could you relate to the Me Too movement? Well, of course. For once, people listen to what we have to say. And it's not just about the rapes. I think the problem is deeper than that. These are obvious abuses of our consent, but there are all sorts of abuses from childhood on where people think they can override our consent. We're pushed to do all sorts of things. And I think that's exactly what the Me Too movement tries to call out. There's not a single time in your life as a woman where you're not sexualized and molested in a way or another. Ask any girl around you. We've all experienced these moments in time when older men look at you in a way that shouldn't even cross their minds. In Odile, I mention a married man who's 32. They meet Odile and her friend when they're 15. This is something that actually happened to me, I can tell you. Writing about it, I'm a little shocked when people tell me that they weren't underage sexually speaking, so it was legal. But morally, at 32, it wouldn't cross my mind to look at a 15-year-old boy the way he looked at a 15-year-old girl. As a child, they already see what we're going to become, and we're going to become females. It happens outside our families, but also inside families. Fathers have this sense of belonging. They know that daughters jumping on their lap will become women, and they belong to them until they belong to other men. That's the problem. Of course, there's sexual violence, rape, but there's this entire education that makes us give in to men's desire. I think we'll keep it here and turn to the floor to see whether there are questions. There'll be a roving mic going through the room, and immediately after this discussion, Emma will be signing her book upstairs. Thank you very much, Emma.
C'était remarquable.
This is very interesting. This discussion was very interesting.
Vous proposez une écriture plus sensible pour les hommes qui parleraient de leur érotisme.
Talk about more sensitive writing for men talking about their erotic life, about eroticism. As an author, what is at stake for a man who would like to write about these things? Well, what I meant is that it's not... The point is not for men writing erotic novels to start talking about the times when they feel vulnerable, when they feel weak. Very often men feel powerless, helpless, facing women's sexuality. Women realize that men feel very little faced with women who are much more resilient, who can come several times in one go. Masculine erotic literature led us to many erroneous ideas. For a long time, I was disconcerted by male erotic literature. I thought I wasn't hardwired the way other women were. I didn't have the ability to come 7 times in a few minutes. Or this is just the result of a fantasy about women's sexuality. It's the same thing with pornography. The point is not to represent sexuality the way it is, but it's, in the case of pornography, it's a farce. I think men could write erotic novels and show the difference, or talk about desire, longing. It's the difference between eroticism and pornography. It's the weight, suggesting things. I'm sure that male sexuality is just as complex as women's sexuality. You take 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Talking about people's loneliness. Despite the encounters, I think that would be much more interesting, and not just looking at one's navel, at one's erection, at one's masculinity. I don't want to give lessons to anyone. I learned a lot from erotic literature, but I also learned how to take 1 step back. I know that erotic literature is not sexuality. It's a circus. I don't know whether that answers your question. Yes, it does. Thank you. Emma, while we wait until someone else asks a question, you could give us a few names. Nicholson Baker, you mentioned a while ago. Yes, Nicholson Baker, who's a U.S. author, and I would suggest reading Vox, which is the story of a man and woman who meet on a phone line, and they talk for a certain number of hours about sexuality, masturbation, imagination. And it's a book that was written by a man at a time where there was no notion of inclusivity and deconstruction. And yet it's one of the most interesting texts written about the clitoris. And it's a tale-telling that was written by a man. They're all the novels written by Françoise Frey. Absolutely marvelous. They're very spontaneous. They're solar. There are lots of erotic novels that are very serious, such as Bataille, for instance. It's very solemn, very heavy. And then there's Apollinaire, Les 11,000 Verges, which is a bit of a farce. It's a little bit like Sade's 120 Days. There's it's very well written. What else? Comic books. I learned a lot from Jean-Marc Reiser, who did a lot of cartoons on the covers of Harakiri and Charlie, the French magazines. Talks a lot about sex with a lot of tenderness. He was very good friends with Alice Schwarzer, who's a radical feminist from Germany, who was able to be his friend despite the fact that he was constantly drawing cocks and cunts, and did so very brilliantly. What else could I recommend? Anaïs Nin. I came to Anaïs Nin a little late in life. Because to me, it's a little fussy. There's a book, La jouissance et l'extase, about Anaïs Nin and a relationship she had in Paris. Very recently, Anaïs Nin and Joachim Nin, her father, their letters were published. They had a real incestuous relationship. It was at the time, it was early days of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysts had no idea how to manage the Oedipus complex, and they would encourage their patients to satisfy this relationship. So these letters were published. They're sometimes hard to read. They're stunning, but they're very interesting. But I'd say Nicholson Baker, Françoise Frey, and Régine Deforge's Blue Bicycle. I grew up with François Tavernier. He was the man of my life. No one knew whether he'd collaborated with the Germans or whether he was in the resistant movement, and yet he was the cornerstone of my sexuality as a teenager. Régine Deforge, who was one of the main editors of erotic literature at her time. Yes, absolutely. Is there one last question from the floor, or should we go directly to the signing? I think we covered the topic quite extensively. Thank you very much, Emma. Thanks you.